Thank you so much for the invitation and for the really nice and kind introduction. I am going to talk a little bit about the work we do as agency, but also as at the research center at Texas Tech that was just mentioned. And in our practice and in our research, we investigate and uncover and find ways to act as researchers and designers in embracing confrontational roles so that we can create objects, forms, spaces, databases, and arguments that instrumentalize spatial justice. And I hope you can kind of see a few of that today. So here's our context. We live just to the right of this image of the border wall. And so our context and our daily lives are defined by this kind of exclusionary infrastructure. And so in this kind of protracted and conflictual context, we're always interested in subverting sub-perceptual and urban atmospheric events that violate human rights. Here, I hope you're seeing this video, but this is the militarized landscape of the El Paso Ciudad Juarez border region. This is 57 miles of border fence that were completed in 2008 as a result of the 2006 Secure Fence Act. And so you can see homes in Ciudad Juarez right across the border fence here. And this is essentially my daily commute to the school. And you can understand here this context that is essentially demarcated by infrastructures, violent infrastructures that are meant to exclude. And then they are layered with this kind of natural division between the two countries, which is the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo. And in this context, more and more infrastructure, because we're in Texas, continues to be built. So you see here this highway above the border fence, and then it straddles along the fence. And then at some point it crosses down south of the border fence into the no man's land, as it is called, where kind of infrastructural investment is really oriented towards sort of an ease of flow for those who are allowed, and then a blockage of flows for those who are not allowed. You also see the train and the rail here that moves product out of the free economic zone in Juarez. This is the train station on the left where I am speaking to you from right now, which is also where the College of Architecture of Texas Tech is located in El Paso. And so if you can kind of like imagine yourselves in this context with me, we're going to kind of think through these territorial scales of acting. So I will talk about just a few sort of chapters of the kind of work we do. We're interested in broadcasting this condition outside of political rhetoric, but just truly to understand sort of the factual context. So we've been broadcasting what we call border dispatches for the Architects newspaper. And here we've documented the legally questionable expansion of identification protocols that are beyond the limits of the ports of entry, and they enter into international territory in order to reduce asylum claims. So as part of the border dispatches, we've documented the use of simulated border security infrastructures that are used to train operatives in lethal force, as you see here in bottom left, which is internationally illegal to shoot across to another country. We've also gained access to detention facilities that you see here on the right in order to document their growing privatization and specialization. And then also in the center, we're interested in revealing the role of the design and construction industry in managing these kinds of sort of remote sensing infrastructures. And you probably were watching this in the summer of 2017. One of these investigations includes this idea that there's a growing number of construction technology patents that are being enabled as a result of the border wall prototypes. And so here you see private companies, construction companies vying for the highly lucrative border wall contract. So we did some digging and found that many of these companies involved in the mock-ups were actually applying for patents for the technology that they developed for the border wall shown here. So a patent for a steel bollard fence was designed by Fisher Industries. We uncovered that actually we illustrated here was piloted just outside of El Paso really quietly over 2 weeks in the summer, 2 summers ago. So since then, this has enabled the rapid construction of miles of border wall through environmentally sensitive areas, through indigenous land, and is contributing to an ongoing lethal humanitarian crisis. I use the word crisis really delicately here at the border. as migrants are continuing to seek alternative routes away from ports of entry, and then they're met with this kind of really powerful kind of way of construction. So this section of the border wall that you see here was the one that was built by Steve Bannon with a kind of through a national fundraising campaign, and they found a like-minded individual who owns this land privately, who is obviously incredibly racist, and so he allowed their private land for this kind of construction technology that Fisher Industries used to test this idea of faster, better, cheaper, which is the architectural triad that we can never seem to have all three, but somehow through this kind of patented technology, they were able to achieve it. And the problem here is that not only the obvious problem of the border wall, but also environmentally, this is a highly polluted area, and the soil that was disturbed is entering the stream of the river, which is the kind of the life source for agriculture in Mexico and in the US. And also it has blocked access to this dam that you see here, which is the Great American Dam. It has blocked access to federal employees to maintain this national piece of infrastructure. And I think through litigation, they found kind of a common ground. But we've seen this technology continue to be deployed across the borderland with damaging effects on ecologies, on landscapes, on human life. And so part of the work we were doing with that article was to alert the architectural community and invite all of us to to kind of not be seduced, right, by this kind of faster, cheaper, better technology, but to really be aware of the tools we use and boycott the ones that were developed at such environmental and human costs. As part of our work here on the border, we work with Amnesty International. And so in this past summer, we actually visualized essentially the overcrowding of immigration detention facilities and their mismanagement by federal federal bodies and by private contractors for whom this has become highly lucrative. And so the issue here was that the overcrowding was contributing to kind of a disproportionate rate of COVID-19 infection in immigration detention. So the map was part of their report, but it's also available online. And using their Freedom of Information Act requests through Amnesty International, we were able to geolocate all of the for-profit and federally run immigration detention centers, and also to be able to highlight the capacity that they're designed for and how many people they're actually holding. And you can imagine that they're holding always more than the allowed capacity. And this was used by Amnesty as an advocate campaign to release migrants from detention into their families and their sponsors while they're awaiting processing. And the map always, the kind of work we do is always interested in the kind of spatial manifestation of the architecture of these kinds of spaces. So if you zoom in, you actually see here on the bottom right, kind of the architectural form of these spaces, and you have a higher resolution idea of how they're built. And they're generally built next to prisons or run by companies who run prisons. And so the overcrowding is especially a problem with spreading COVID infections in this kind of really vulnerable population. And so the images you see here on the right are also our original images as we've gained access to kind of visit and document these conditions. More and more, they seem to overlap with kind of prison-like punishment for people who actually are exercising their basic human right to seek asylum. And so in this kind of context, we use our data in our own ways in order to compute. And so I'll share this one project quickly. This was sort of a recent initiative in our research center. The idea is to merge our investigative territorial research with design research that we've developed as academics outside of our practice. And so first I'll cover a little bit of like sort of essentially how we build this information. Due to global warming, there are shifting patterns of ultraviolet exposure in North America, and that they map very closely to the international border with high intensities even in the winter months. So the 30th degree parallel here crosses the borderland is a charged UV exposure boundary. With the effects of climate change, populations below this boundary we'll continue to see increased risk of sunburn and other negative health effects related to UV exposure. And so the lack of shade in the borderland, as you can see here, and the amount of atmospheric scattering from airborne dust, which is really prevalent here, really increased the health risk to individuals. What we're finding out is that UV exposure actually is amplified in dusty conditions. But at the same time, the national security apparatus has become expert at deploying tactical infrastructures that mitigate the impact of ultraviolet radiation on its agents in order for them to inspect and manage other bodies with more efficiency. So building on these tactical interventions, the federal border security apparatus has developed an appetite for shade in the borderland and has continued to invest in more permanent purpose-built structures. And we're seeing a proliferation of purpose-built shade structure, even for equipment, not even for Border Patrol agents or humans, but really to protect cameras and surveillance apparatus so that they don't get UV damage because it gets really hot here. But then at the same time, while migrants are actually sort of relegated to ad hoc spaces that are always exposed without any shade, this is the highly securitized El Paso Ciudad Juarez Metroplex, which is one of the largest binational urban environments in the Western Hemisphere, where the physiological effects of solar radiation are relentlessly rendered upon vulnerable populations. This was the famous image that circulated in summer 2018, where people were really just kind of like this, waiting while the security apparatus was protected. And so in this context, what can we do, right? How do we engage these kinds of infrastructures that behave at such fundamental scales? So we are working on this project that we're calling Irradiated Shade. And the standard architectural analysis tools always fail us in these kinds of contexts. They fail the nuances of the types of bodies that architecture is meant to include or exclude, but also even just environmental analyses don't take into account these kinds of asymmetries. So in the research center, we've been developing these maps of shade surplus, shade deficit, and irradiated shade of these kinds of spaces. And we're developing a computational workflow and a representational strategy in order to assess shade designs from a scatter perspective. Mapping diffuse solar radiation, we can actually begin to see a clearly unequal and asymmetrical distribution of UV protection. So you see relatively low amounts of diffuse radiation that are shown in the yellow tones. That's around downtown and a kind of the better served areas. And then you see a lot of lack of shade protection towards the border, towards the bottom of the slide. And so there's a direct asymmetrical distribution of UV radiation. Borrowing on logics that are built into solar analysis in GIS, we actually are developing our own tools in order to visualize and assess this condition, moving to a more kind of immediate design slash drawing environment. So this is where we think designers actually are able to design their own tools as well as the environment that the tool is working with. So to better understand the impact of building geometry on UV exposure in urban space, we developed this kind of spherical projection algorithm in Rhino and Grasshopper. And so we've been deploying this algorithm at highly trafficked intersections around our region here in order to reveal the varying degrees of exposure to the sky and therefore the diffuse radiation and damage from UVB. Each intersection, as you can imagine, yields a different and highly articulated sky exposure, which we use as a kind of computable surface. From the images, we can actually better see which orientations have clear channels of exposure from ground to the sky. And as we continue to develop the interface and the outputs from the computational toolset, we're integrating an ability to better visualize and assess the relationship of sky exposure to solar orientation. We've sampled every major pedestrian intersection of the borderland in order to compile what we call a sky exposure catalog of this metroplex, and it color codes each by their exposure area, graphically identifying the areas at highest risk of exposure to diffuse radiation. And exposure, as we might expect, you see here to the bottom left, increases in highly trafficked public spaces that are nearest the international boundary. And then towards the top right, we're moving towards downtown. And so we began, right now we're in a kind of prototyping phase and exploring possible forms for a structure that might become a didactic structure that combats this kind of UV scatter, but also that might be deployable in areas where it is needed. I will show very quickly 2 built projects, and these are a few years ago, but they make sense within this kind of conversation. So using the data and the tool sets that we design ourselves, we're interested in kind of exposing these issues of loss of rights in public space. And the first project is the selfie wall. And one visible aspect of data that we're interested in public space is this kind of meta layer or metadata of the online life of our own photography and our own geotagging of our geolocations. Bots, as you can imagine, are constantly scraping and building sort of mirrors of your online profile and your footprint. And so the question is, who controls it? Who trades with it? How does this actually impact our lives in public space? Facial recognition software is actually used to determine our daily patterns in space. And as it creates profile, is actually being used in some instances to understand whether or not we are deemed healthy. And some of this kind of data has been floated around to be used by health insurance companies, private health insurance companies, that can actually determine premiums based on the way in which your face is analyzed, whether it being healthy or not, or whether you're aging quicker than you're supposed to. So this is a real important issue in terms of understanding kind of our role in this kind of public realm. So through a commissioned public installation, when we first moved to El Paso 6 years ago, we decided that maybe we could create the context for a discussion about this idea of public profiles. And as architects and designers, we were also interested in building the space that maybe would sort of coerce or create the environment for selfie taking, so that becomes a trigger for a conversation. So the best way to do this was by flattering people's photographic appearance. So by borrowing from stage set design, we fabricated a series of essentially light reflectors that behave like stage lights. And we're always interested in using digital fabrication technique. This was CNC. Sorry, that's the train. This is CNC flip milled kind of sheets. Wow, this is the longest the train is. Okay, here we go. So these are aluminum panels that are flip milled, and the idea here is to use digital sort of technologies as a way to streamline and to create easier workflows for ourselves to install this and to build this ourselves, and we consider ourselves unskilled labor. And so this is kind of another sort of trajectory that follows the built work, essentially making construction easy and accessible by using the kind of high-end technologies that are available to us in academia. So we made over 150 different shapes from this kind of flip milled geometry. And as you know, right, if you're using a CNC or any kind of robotic arm, complexity is free. So why not, right? Why not every single piece being radically different if we actually can make this work for us? And the resulting shade units act both as light reflectors and as well as self-structuring units, because this thing had to stand up on its own in order to create these kind of inner and outer facing reflection cones that create different types of conditions. And this was part of a public arts installation that lasts a weekend. So it's a temporary installation, which really made sense for the selfie, because if this were permanent, we would not have built it for obvious reasons. And so we were able to create this kind of indoor room that has warm and yellow pink tones, while the outside side of it is lit with cool white and blue tones. And the idea here is that there is a range of lighting that could flatter any kind of skin tone and any skin with any kind of makeup level, so that we can actually sort of essentially act almost like a really expensive bathroom mirror that flatters people. So the lighting range was meant to create these sort of different kinds of spaces that any one of us would be attracted to. And during the day, the semi-glossy white cones actually created an extra bright environment where it almost felt like a daytime filter, like the high exposure filter on our phone. And sort of these are some of the images, and the idea was to also, if for the fabricators in the room, to pair this with like a really soft pillow-shaped fabric that would diffuse the light so that our faces were not directly lit. And here it is, that equivalent lit at night, where the light is actually reflected from the interior of these soft fabrics. And it really became a fun game, and families were here. I think we had about 2,000 people who visited. And the important moment was when we actually were asking people to tag with a selfie wall their photographs, and we were able to have these kinds of conversation where if you face the selfie wall, you have this flattering image of yourself, and then facing away from the selfie wall, the facial recognition actually is obscured, and you can kind of hide. There's been a lot of studies about these sort of kind of hiding a light. There's masks, and there's scarves and things like that obstruct from the vision of the bot. But here on the right, you see this image. This is the most important part of the project. We had a projection screen, and this is a very closed loop. Like, we were able to data scrape the hashtag selfies and project them here. And then we were able to have a conversation with people who were really startled by our ability to collect their photographs and to be able to understand and to geolocate where they were taken. Even though we share our photographs on Facebook and in social media all of the time, the kind of the physicality of this sort of gathering seemed to become to offer a better forum for this kind of conversation of the dangers of online sharing. So right after this evening, we disassembled the selfie wall, and this sort of data scraping bot is offline, and this Instagram feed doesn't work anymore. But it was really meant to kind of to find the physical equivalent of an architectural space as a proxy for a much larger conversation. So now this has become a part of a kind of a public awareness campaign in the work. And the last project I'll show as a kind of an installation was our way of getting to know our students when we moved here and to getting to know our context. We were really struck by the traffic cones, as you see here, these barrels, that they seem to move depending on the times of day and the days of the week. So regardless of what the binational policy of trade routes and traffic is in the US-Mexico border here in El Paso and Juarez, the soldiers on the ground that enact that kind of policy become these barrels. So Border Patrol agents are constantly moving the lanes and shifting them in relationship to traffic patterns, in relationship to trade routes, and kind of volume during different times of the day. And so we were just really struck by this like power of soft infrastructure to shape and control space. And we decided to call the company that lends these to the Texas Department of Transportation, and they were super willing to lend them to us for what we called like a student party. Every time architecture has been benignly labeled as kind of an activity or an arts installation, we seem to be able to kind of gain access to these types of things. And so this was the Beaux-Arts Ball for the school. So we were able to take about 256 of these cones out of commission for about a weekend. That's all they can lend them to us. And so we're thinking, okay, what can we do? Like, how can we kind of really have an exercise in again, another way of sort of digital fabrication flows, but while also creating space. And so we calculated a way to hang all of them into a kind of cloud pattern in a leftover piece of infrastructure that has become the parking lot for our school, which used to be the bus station for the buses that used to go across the border, and they don't do that anymore. So this kind of infrastructure relic is important, and it's occupied by us and our students daily. And so here is our little kind of weekend event where we're all essentially cataloging these barrels using the really precise drawing from, this is just a simple grasshopper script, but the idea was to measure chain in a certain way that this would be foolproof, so that many hands working together would actually be able to install a precise cloud. And it worked more or less. This is pretty precise with that one fold in the center that we wanted. But it really just became a canopy for our Beaux-Arts ball, which is such a sort of standard or such a like ubiquitous architectural event. But it also became a moment for discussion and for contemplation with our students. And then as night came, it became a party space. You can imagine the reflectors above. We used parking reflectors on the ground as well, really sort of like sandwich that kind of space of infrastructure into a scale where we could all have this event together. And as usual, you can see those are the Juarez Mountains in the background. That's the border highway, and right here is the parking lot for the school. And there's always some kind of border patrol or police kind of around making their presence known. And here are our students at the party, and they came dressed as whatever character they thought made sense to inhabit this kind of infrastructure. And it really became just an amazing evening of understanding kind of the consequences of not only hardened infrastructure, but these soft, sort of like softwares of infrastructure that become extensions of the way that our daily lives are controlled and our public spaces are controlled. And I'm going to end with the sort of, I'm going to close right with this idea of production. What is it that we actually produce at the end of the day? Because most of our installations are temporary, and that suits our kind of our investigations really well. So I'm going to end with the production of catalogs and maps and taxonomies that really kind of essentially send this research out to the world and hopefully help to build knowledge. So from local and these regional frontiers, we actually, in the book that just came out, we zoom out to global fronts at a very different scale. This book collects our own research and writing and mappings and speculative drawings that concern the many fronts that we see are impacting global cities outside of the border region. So here from our current location, we've been able to document how the US military constructs these fronts. And you can see here training in progress in a simulated built brick and mortar town that's meant to simulate quote unquote somewhere in the Middle East, and you see a tank crossing the street. So these are sort of firsthand visits through these sites. And fronts, as we suggest in the book, are a different kind of like a global transnational space, a boundary, a front, right, a border. But they are also new constellations of cities and urban patterns that are developed from these kind of agonistic interchanges of security and development pressures. In the book, uncovers this growing geography of these secretive simulated cities built on military installations, both in the US and all over the world. And they're meant to train for combat troops in urban warfare. So the city is the protagonist for urban warfare training. And what we've been doing is scraping these disjointed public records, congressional hearings, budget appropriations, as well as military construction budgets, where we're actually able to identify, geolocate, and document over 500 of them in the world and 300 plus in the United States. And so what we found is that these simulated urban environments in them, the city combat training sites are actually becoming more and more urban in character, as you see here through this time-lapse video, as they attempt to increase the realism of effectively training for the use of force in dense environments. The military is now developing its own extensive urban inventory. These rival the size of civilian cities. And so there's a shadow urbanism, achieving a density and variety of buildings and infrastructure that is steadily approaching the diversity and the intensity of what they would call real world cities. So the sites are stand-ins for city-form military that militaries are seeking to dominate, and they become excerpts of this kind of global urbanism that is a copy-paste urbanism of specific interests to the United States military. And while sites are becoming more urban, the opposite is also true, that real cities, civilian cities, are becoming training sites. They're increasingly used to simulate and the fabric of a future urbanized war. So many American cities that are abandoned actually are taken over either by the DoD, the Department of Defense, or other independent entities that rent them out for training. So reality and fake are really close together. So here you see an example, which is in Playas in New Mexico. It's very close to where we live. This was a copper mining town that was abandoned completely in a really quick period of time, right after the copper mining industry failed. And so the suburban homes have been repurposed by New Mexico Tech, which is a university that specializes in explosives and pyrotechnics. And so they use this and then they rent it out to the Department of Defense, but they also rent it out to Hollywood for films. So Batman versus Superman opening scene that's meant to be somewhere in the Middle East is actually filmed here. So you also see kind of this conflation between urban warfare and its proxy in movies. So the book dives deep into one particular city form that we're interested in, which is called the Combined Arms Collective Training Facilities. And this is the gold standard of urban warfare training per military doctrine. This is where infantry, tanks, and air operations can simultaneously be deployed together, and they can simultaneously test their force against these kind of brick and mortar real buildings that are built. So we've located over 30 of these facilities and can learn a lot about about the military's posture towards urban environments from deep analysis and from their architectural and urban forms. So this Combined Arms training facility mandates the replication of certain urban and architectural typologies that you see here. There's about 26 of these building types that absolutely have to be built physically when these cities are being replicated. And that actually allows military troops to have a certain kind of pass before they're deployed. And so we've identified just specifically 6 spatial types that we're interested in that are common to the developing world. They're commonly simulated in these and other sites. So we have, from left to right, we have camps, refugee camps, the zone, the dump, which is what the name suggests, right? Kind of leftover space, the graveyard, which also can be occupied, the squat, which are squatted compounds, and also the jail. And so you're starting to see as we're cataloging these kind of spatial typologies, we're starting to really understand the military's gaze upon these very specific kinds of locations. So our simulated cities database, which is in the book and is soon going to be available online, we've been working on it. This is going to be the first publicly accessible geolocated database of these sites and allows all of us to better understand the urban and architectural forms that are commonly targeted, that are deemed suspect or even criminalized. And so from this kind of position, we can identify familiar forms amongst the urban clusters and also who the outliers are. And so the book, sorry, I'm trying to move, so there we go. So in the database, and the book sort of dives deeper and deeper and catalogs more and more of these kind of aerial visionings, but in the database, we reveal that the architectural designs are copied with only slight variation on multiple installations, which starts to also talk about the generalization of an other, right, by the military. So we're able to actually identify each building type and its prevalence across a widespread geography through essentially scraping Google Earth. So an intentionally repetitive and predictable assembly of urban forms, of architectural types, and material systems are deployed throughout the geography of simulation, and this is by design. So as we've seen, a large number of these secretive urban simulation sites have propagated and evolved over the last several decades. So the book starts actually from right before World War I until now. All signs suggest that this shadow urbanism will only continue to grow and spread. These sites are more than just a collection of urban simulacra, right? Our argument is that they are actually spatial mechanisms for exerting state power. From this position on the simulated cities, these physical simulated cities, a militaristic viewpoint of our collective urban future is continuously absorbed, it's rehearsed, it's ingrained, and then threatens to project back into the world and shape cities in its image. And I kind of just wanted to leave you with these two maps. So these are some of the maps that we've been able to build and that will become sort of geolocated online, that there's about 500 of these through a specific kind of cataloging. And these are the ones that we've been able to find in the United States that will also become publicly available. And so I just kind of wanted to leave you here, ending with this image. As a way to kind of to zoom out and to really sort of talk about the way in which we produce and we gather kind of data and build maps and expose them to the world. And we do this through many platforms for different reasons, but agency works at the kind of migration detention center with Amnesty Scale. Post, which is the research center at Texas Tech, has been really instrumental in mapping and building these kind of GIS databases. And we've just launched the Border Consortium, which also is a new initiative sponsored by the ACSA last summer, so 6 months ago or so, where the idea is to have a consortium that collects all of the thinkers and the researchers, both in Mexico and in the US, who are doing similar work, but the data does not necessarily translate or transcend the boundary, but also as a way to kind of advocate for sort of more in-depth research that moves beyond the kind of the sensationalizing of the border wall and really dives deep into data and map making. So thank you.